I would like to welcome you to today's webinar, Selecting the Right Sourcing Provider for Long-Term Success. My name is Arlene Itori, and I'm a webinar coordinator for the Outsourcing Institute, and it is our pleasure to be the co-host of today's event with West Corporation. I'll be working in the background to help answer any technical or general questions that you have. But before we begin, I'd like to quickly tell you about a few tools you'll be able to use throughout today's session. First, we encourage you at any time during the presentation to submit your questions to today's speakers. To do this, click on the questions box, type your question in the space provided, and click on the Submit button. During today's presentation, we'll be asking poll questions to get to know you better and to help ensure that the content is relevant to your specific needs. When the poll appears, be sure to select the answer that best fits each question. Today's webinar is being recorded. You will be receiving a follow-up email in approximately 2 days, which will include a link with today's recorded webinar and presentation slides. The webinar recording and the presentation slides will also be available at outsourcing.com. Now I'd like to say a few words about the Outsourcing Institute. The Outsourcing Institute is a professional association dedicated to providing independent best practices, tools, roadshow events, and networking opportunities for all forms of outsourcing. Located at outsourcing.com, we have 70,000 members globally. OI specializes in providing low-cost and no-cost alternatives for outsourcing buyers in need of RFP tools, vendor selection assistance, training, as well as general support and coaching. For those of you who market in this space, we offer an array of very targeted sponsorship and promotional opportunities. Our sister company, CMS, provides recruiting services for those seeking to hire outsourced professionals experienced at buying, selling, managing, or consulting in this arena. Our contact information is on the bottom of the screen for those of you who have any questions. Following are some events that OI is planning. First, we have the Outsourcing Institute Roadshow, which is focusing on outsourcing governance and relationship management. This roadshow event will be held on December 5th in New York City. And also, I'd like to mention the moderator for today's webinar, Mike Beals, will be one of the co-chairs for that roadshow event. The following day in New York City is the Sales Readiness 2013 Summit, what outsourcing service providers need to succeed in the new year. There are some other dates and locations for that event as well next year. We are also planning the Wall Street Tech Conference show on March 13th, and we'll be covering what's known as T5, sourcing, cloud computing, big data, mobility, security, and compliance. To find out more details, please visit outsourcing.com/events. So without further ado, I will now turn it over to our moderator, Mike Beals, CEO of CELA Group. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Arlene. Appreciate the opportunity to talk with everybody today. And obviously, we have rescheduled this as a result of Hurricane Sandy, so hopefully everything has gotten back to normal and you folks didn't have too much damage on that. So my background, just very quickly, have a lot of experience in relationship management and governance over the years for outsourcing and shared services groups, and am joined today by Matt Driscoll, at EVP of Business Solutions at West Corporation. Matt's been in the industry for 17 years. His group is responsible for supporting over 12,000 dedicated inbound customer care agents that are made up of domestic, nearshore, offshore, at-home agents through a number of different channels. So welcome, Matt. Thanks for sponsoring this session.
Thanks, Mike.
Yep. So our topic today is selecting the right sourcing provider for long-term success. We're going to cover some of the broader set of selection criteria and the reasons companies outsource call centers and other communication areas and back office areas. but we're going to focus on the long-term relational aspects of these multi-year relationships. And although the context used today is communication services, these principles are generally applicable to any kind of outsourcing relationship, particularly ITO and BPO. So I think, as most of us have all seen, there are a multitude of studies out there, past and present, concluding that how you and your service provider manage and govern your relationship is the #1 determinant of success. And so what we wanted to do today on this first slide is just to kind of put this up in context and say there's really a life cycle. We tend to think of governance and account management on the front end, but there's really a whole life cycle, and you need to look at your relationships and make that selection according to that for that entire relationship. So just very briefly, on the front end, after you do an assessment, organizations typically put together an RFP, and what we would encourage you to do is to really think through what kind of account management and relationship management requirements you have to put those in the RFP. Really address those in terms of the selection criteria as you're evaluating different service providers in the RFP process and that selection, assessing the fit and the capabilities of the service provider. In transition, obviously building out your governance capability and aligning that with the capabilities of the service provider. Steady state is really assessing the relationship because things change and these are multi-year agreements, so you really have to realign things. And then toward contract term, proactively realigning or remediating those relationships through that. So that's the framework we'd like to use. Matt, any comments on this type of a framework or this perspective from a buyer?
No, I think it's fairly straightforward, but to your point, it is a life cycle, and it has to continually be reevaluated throughout.
Right. Okay. So let's start at the beginning, Matt, and from a client's perspective, what are the main reasons that you see companies outsourcing the areas that you're responsible for?
Sure. When looking to outsource, there's really some key areas that we see customers focusing on, and these are really high-level reasons that we'll talk to. But first and foremost, cost containment. They're typically looking to us in one of two areas: is how do I help drive cost containment from a labor perspective, or potential real estate costs, or a combination of both. And really the high priority within this is labor arbitrage. So when looking to outsource, does the provider offer a footprint, whether it be domestic, offshore, nearshore, or at home type support that allows them to drive that true labor arbitrage, or some combination thereof of all of those. The second one is staff augmentation. Many people have seasonal or peak staffing needs. This can be on a regular, consistent basis. It may be billing cycles on a weekly or monthly basis. It may be related to seasonal needs around, for example, holiday in the retail vertical. Or it may be due to the fact that they have limits to their physical space and they're just not able to flex the way they need to. So they tend to look at it from a staff augmentation standpoint. The third is technology. In most cases, there may be upgrades that are needed, but the company's not wanting to invest in the technology to upgrade, if you will. They may look at it and say, we think our technology is adequate, but as we move forward, it doesn't allow us the flexibility we need to offer additional services that may be very singular threaded. The fourth is looking to improve their overall customer satisfaction, and this is really relying on outsourcers to provide best practices across verticals and or experience. In this case, they may be looking to improve customer satisfaction. They may be looking to reduce churn. They may be looking to improve overall call resolution, or any combination of the above. And when you look at those first four, those are pretty straightforward in terms of how they're evaluated and what they're looking for from an objective. The next three are a little more advanced, if you will, and they require, they're looking at more of a transformation in their solution. So first is solution development, expansion, and or support. This really requires an outsourcer to offer, or them to evaluate an outsourcer that can provide multiple facets in a solution, not necessarily a singular solution. Another case might be looking to an outsourcer to provide best practices or market insight. They may just not know what they don't know, if you will, and they look to outsourcers who may provide similar solutions across multiple businesses within a particular vertical. And then finally, increase revenue and profit, and that really can be a combination of all the above to help drive that. But more and more, call centers are looking to drive revenue and not just be cost centers, if you will. So again, the first three or four are pretty straightforward, but the next three really require what I would consider advanced skills to develop those types of solutions.
So Matt, let me just ask you a question real quick. I mean, this is a pretty diverse set of reasons to outsource. Do you see any kind of trends, 5 years ago versus now in terms of what that intent is?
Yeah, I think if you look back 3 to 4 years ago, you saw in the industry, my feeling is that there was a large focus on initially driving to a customer satisfaction call resolution standpoint, and as we kind of got into the economic environment that we're in, you saw call volumes drop off, so customers were focused on either not outsourcing or potentially reducing the outsourcing relationships they had. As the economic environment continued to go on for 2 to 3 years, what you saw was then it moved into more of a cost containment phase as opposed to servicing the customer. And I think what you're seeing then is you saw a lot of labor arbitrage, a lot of movement offshore, and now what you're seeing is that starting to come back into the customer satisfaction realm. So you tend to see these cycles where it goes from a cost play to a service play to a cost play to a service play.
Right. Well, so then based on why companies are outsourcing and what they intend to accomplish, I mean, that's a pretty important factor, is what your intent is. Can you then talk us through some of the typical selection criteria that you see companies using, and a little bit about the connection between the two?
Sure. So if you look at the next slide, really once you've determined why you're outsourcing, I think then you need to look at what's important in a potential provider or partnership. First and foremost, what is their business and industry experience? Do they have particular skill or expertise in the vertical that you're in? I think that's important, and that really ties back to their ability to offer best practices and some market insights. Again, footprint, if I'm looking to drive, if cost containment and labor arbitrage are important, does the provider offer a footprint that allows me to achieve that, or some combination of footprint that allows me to achieve that? That could be particular location, particular state, anything of that nature. It can be onshore, near shore, it can be offshore, it can even be at home, which offers some unique advantages, not necessarily in the cost of labor, but more in the flexibility of how you staff your call center or your support mechanisms. Another one is project management capabilities. And there's really two components to this. And first is what is their skill set and what is their ability to support a new client launch, and then the ongoing account management. But then two, if you really want a relationship, which we'll talk to later, that transitions over time, do they have the skill set to drive governance and enhancements across that? So we'll talk to that a little bit more in detail. But again, what are their abilities to transition the work successfully, not only initially, but then over time? The next one is technology. What does a provider offer, and what is my need? Do I need a provider that has a single solution that fits my single purpose, or do I need a provider that can offer a suite of solutions that I may or may not take advantage of initially, but may grow into that suite of solutions over time? And then from there, is it homegrown, or is it off the shelf? And really the question there is what is the flexibility and what is the cost of that solution? And then is it portable over time? If I had to potentially migrate elsewhere, could I port that solution with me? So those are things that you have to evaluate. And then solution delivery capabilities. Why am I outsourcing? Does the provider have the tools and experience? That's both tools and experience in delivering those types of solutions. And then can they help me drive some other components of that? For example, I may want a better solution, so I want to do automation, which also helps me drive my cost containment component of my need. And then, of course, innovation. And this is really more of a transformation type solution, not necessarily a single solution. But what is their roadmap and where are they headed? Do I have influence on that roadmap? Does that roadmap align with my roadmap? An example might be technology. Is the company investing in technology, and does that roadmap align with where I want to take my outsourcing solution? And finally, Mike, I know you'll talk to this a little bit later, but the relationship expectations. What do you expect from a provider? And then at the same time, what does the provider expect from you? And is that partnership and that requirements aligned? An example might be, am I a big fish in a little pond? Or am I a little fish in a big pond? And then do I get what I need out of that relationship over time? And I think at this point, what I'd like to do is to be interesting from the group is if we could poll the group and see what selection criteria is important to them.
Yes, if everybody could take a minute to just click on which one of those following are the most critical to you, either in making a past selection or in a current selection that you're doing. That would be a good thing to know. And we'll give you just a minute to fill that out before we keep going.
Okay, and the poll will be closing in 10 seconds.
Right, Matt, you want to comment on these first?
Sure. So business industry and experience, and then solution delivery capabilities obviously being the top two. I think, again, as we mentioned, really looking for that experience, that best practice, and really those two lead me to believe that you're looking for solutions that are more transformation in nature, not necessarily transactional. And I think you'll talk to that a little bit too. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what this indicates to me is that, you mentioned the labor arbitrage before. You talked through some of the technology and some of those things, and it seems to me this audience is saying that they're considering those things table stakes, or those are the expectations that everybody is bringing to the table. But the thing that they are going to use to select that provider is really some of these longer-term, more complex things that require a higher-order relationship, a different kind of relationship between the two parties, and a different type of capability that the service provider can bring to the table that really drives that transformation. So I absolutely agree with that. So I think what we'll do, that's actually a real good segue into what we have next. So what we've really talked about are some of these elements on the front end of that life cycle that we mentioned. We talked about why do people outsource, why do companies outsource, and what's the intent, what is that selection criteria. And then this type of a model has been very helpful in the past. It's based on research that's been around for a while, and I know I've used it personally for about the last dozen years or so. But what it really represents is a model so you can look at different types of relationships and figure out where you want to be on this relationship spectrum. At the far left, and we've mentioned this word a couple of times, transactional. This is really about the acquisition of commodity products and services. You can pretty easily swap out service providers here because you're not only telling them what you want them to do, but you're telling them how to do it. And this is really where labor arbitrage becomes important. And this is somewhat cumulative, but then you move up to value added where the provider is providing some level of customization. They know a little bit more about you. They've got a little more flexibility. As you get into specialized, this is what some organizations refer to as a more collaborative relationship. And this is really where transformation starts to take place. The provider knows about you. As you guys just mentioned, the industry experience is important. You are sharing your business objectives and business drivers with them, and then they create or work with you to create value as a result of that. So they're not just providing commodity products and services, they're developing solutions with you. And then finally, the unique is really can be more of a joint venture or a partnership in a legal sense where you have shared risk and reward, deeply integrated, mutually dependent. So as you look through and you think about outsourcing, where you end up on this spectrum is determined by your reasons to outsource, what are you really trying to accomplish, and then your selection criteria should also play a big weight in this. And then where we're going to go in a few minutes is what type of account management capabilities are you looking for in a service provider, and what type of governance capabilities do you really need? The expectations as you move across this spectrum by you and you of the service provider and the service provider of you are going to change pretty dramatically as you move across this continuum. There's no right answer, so you are going to have a lot of transactional relationships. You're probably going to have a good number of value added and some specialized. There's no right answer. It's all based on what you really want and what the intent of that particular deal is. So the other quick point I'll make, and we want to see how Matt and West really addresses these aspects and the ongoing aspects of the life cycle. So before I ask Matt a couple of questions here, let's do another polling question to see from your perspective, what type of relationship are you currently in or are establishing? And so there's kind of a gap that emerges here between what type of relationship is present and what you want it to be. Let's just go with what kind of relationship do you currently have? And we'll leave the poll open for about a minute here. And I would speculate that the fact that the selection criteria that the feedback on the last poll was really driven around solution development and really needing a provider with industry experience would indicate a decent amount of higher order relationships and not many on the transactional end. But let's see how that turns out. Okay, so that's pretty much what we expected, I think. So we have nobody is saying that they have a transactional relationship, and this is kind of what we refer to as vendors. Most outsourcing organizations are more service providers than that. But once again, as we defined it, value added is willing to do some customization, some flexibility. They know a little bit more about you and are willing to modify their services. But then we have a full third that are specialized or unique that have quite a bit of integration in the processes between you and your service provider, and you really have to have a higher order capability. Matt, any comments from your perspective?
No, I think that ties back to what we've been discussing. I think it ties back to the comment earlier around I think we've been through a cycle of transactional type relationships, and I think people are looking now to evolve those and start to establish relationships that can benefit them in other ways. So good.
Okay, great. Well, so let's move on to the next slide. And so thinking back to that relationship management life cycle that we started off with, we've discussed those initial stages. So Matt, if you could kind of walk us through how West aligns the relationship after you've been selected, through that transition period and getting things established in that client relationship.
Sure. So really, when we look at the engagement, we're going to talk through 4 steps. And what I want to note is all of these are intended to, you'd like to have the ability to implement and drive all of these actions. But that, again, how much of this and how integrated you get really is dependent upon the type of relationship you have. So if you have a transactional relationship, some of these may not apply because you may not necessarily want to be that engaged. But the other side of the spectrum is if you want a specialized or a unique relationship, then some of these have to come into play to allow you to evolve the relationship. Keeping in mind that most relationships, while you may want a specialized or unique relationship, they all tend to somewhat start out as transactional because it requires an outsourcer to build that tribal knowledge, if you will, so that they become much more intimate with your customers and your processes and procedures. That's when they begin to start to drive expansion of the relationship and move it from a transactional to a unique relationship. So first and foremost is the discovery phase. In that, you want to ensure that there's an alignment of the transition team. And I mentioned this on a couple slides earlier, is there's really project management capabilities. There's really 2 components. One in my mind is the PMO organization that really drives the initial migration or transition. That team is very specialized in what they do. But then there's the day-to-day ongoing management. In my mind, they work together, but they are 2 different skill sets. There's requirement is to integrate with corporate culture. It's very important that outsourcers understand the brand that they're supporting, they adopt that. Making sure that we define key outcomes and expectations. We talked about outcomes earlier around why and you would outsource and what selection criteria you're looking at. But make sure we understand what those outcomes are, and then what are the expectations around those. That's very important in ensuring that we define the appropriate skill sets and that we put those in place initially. Prioritize those outcomes. We all have multiple outcomes that we're achieving, so we weight those and make sure we understand the priorities. And then define the success factors, making sure that we have defined measurements of success so that we can continually, otherwise it's difficult to have a continuous improvement process. The next step is the solution. Again, the PMO organization really requires a unique skill set. They need to understand what the solution needs are and then craft the solution accordingly. They'll design it, making sure that we have an outcome and value discussion around that, making sure that we calibrate with the customer so that we're in agreement as to what the solution needs to do. And again, the solution may have phases or evolution stages to it. We may start out as a fairly generic solution, and then over time may or throughout different phases may add or enhance that solution, but making sure what those are. Measuring return on investment, and then the risk assessment. Again, it kind of ties back to what are the outcomes, what are the priorities, what's the proper weighting, and then what's the risk against that. Transition 3, or step 3 in this is the transition process. Early on, particularly if you're going to take or drive a specialized or value-added or unique type partnership, you really want to have a stakeholder meeting and ensure that all parties, the appropriate parties, are meeting and establishing what those objectives are so that we're all on the same page and we have the proper buy-in within both organizations. Obviously, we have a kickoff. What are the resource expectation session? Again, do I have the right talent in place to support not only the transition, but then support the ongoing expectations of the relationship? Making sure that I have the proper components around talent acquisition, training, program development, and testing. And then again, what's the risk assessment and communication protocol? And then 4 is integration. We get the process up and running. We certainly need to make sure that there's post-go-live discussion. What is the warranty period around that, if you will? And then having 30, 60, 90-day assessments or reviews, so that, again, we're going back to what are the defined KPIs, if you will, and then what are the success factors in communicating those, and then a scorecard review. That's really part of that is regurgitating the data, if you will. You should know that as you go along. But then, more importantly, is where are we headed? How do we raise that bar? What are future outcomes? How can we enhance that program? That comes over time as you gain that knowledge, and that's where you begin to take that, again, from a transactional relationship to the far right of the spectrum. So ideally, again, and tied back to the contractual component of it, Mike, depending on what type you want, some of these take time. So contracts tend to, from a length of contract, tend to tie back to the type of relationship you want. Transactional, because you can get up and running and gain that tribal knowledge pretty quickly and you're not looking to enhance beyond that, those contracts may be a year in length. If you're looking for a partner and out of the gate you want to develop and push for a specialized or unique relationship, that transition period may take much longer. So those contracts may be 3, 4, 5 years in length.
Okay, appreciate that. And could you comment real quick on, so this is what Wes does. What do you see as being critical from your client's perspective that they put in place in terms of their participation in transition and the type of governance that they establish?
Yeah, well, let's go to the next slide and we'll talk about kind of the account management and the governance, and I think I can answer your question there, Mike.
Okay.
So if you look at, now, you've selected the partner, you've gone through the transition. Now what is the steady state process, and then what is the level of engagement or investment we have to make on both sides? So first and foremost, I mentioned making sure that a provider has the right skill sets. One is for the PMO organization or the group that's going to manage that transition. They're going to develop the transition, the integration plan. They're going to provide the status updates. They're going to collect and own all of that. Really, from a PMO organization, we're going to look to have a peer or a point of contact on the client side to match us so that we can have the proper communication and escalations as necessary. But then note, we also have the day-to-day management team. Those are going to manage the overall management of the project on a day-to-day. They're going to provide the leadership within the outsourced organization. They're going to provide the communication back to the customer. They're accountable for driving the performance objectives and making sure that they meet or exceed those KPIs and those outcomes and driving that. Again, I think Wes looks at it and says that's 2 different skill sets, but at the same time, our client typically may or may not provide 2 different points of contact. Typically, the point of contact is the same for both the PMO as well as for the day-to-day, and then that point of contact has to bring in the appropriate skill sets around IT, telephony, whatever those might be. So again, these are essential to any type of relationship, whether it's transactional in nature or unique in nature. But if you jump to the next slide, I think this is where it's really important to separate yourself. It's important to expanding that relationship and moving it to the right side of the spectrum. And it's important that both parties understand that because they'll have an investment. So again, from that standpoint, an exec or a steering committee, and really what's important here is that first bullet, is you're going to drive the appropriate individuals into a steering committee or an executive committee, and they're going to establish the strategic direction and objectives of the program. And really that requires representation from both parties. And then having a governance process where that group is meeting on a consistent basis, whether it's quarterly, semi-annually, or annually, depending on the type of relationship and the needs, to really say what is the need going forward so that we can plan and craft that solution in advance of that need. And then you have a working committee that takes that direction and makes sure that it's disseminated and that's properly planned for in the account management process on our side. Our account management process is critical to ensuring that we're addressing client needs, not only on a day-to-day, but on a go-forward basis, that we're working in advance of that need, and we're not caught by surprise. And then the day-to-day governance, obviously, is making sure that you have the continual mechanism by which you're communicating information to or from the executive committee, and then driving those results accordingly. So again, I think that's where, if you really want to evolve the relationship, both parties have to have a buy-in and support some type of steering committee, or stakeholder committee, if you will, and making sure that they meet on a consistent basis. Without that governance process, I think what happens is that relationship then starts to slide back to the left side of the spectrum, if you will, and becomes more transactional because there's not that forward-looking, proactive development. There's more of a day-to-day reactive management process.
Right. Yeah, that's a great comment, and I've heard it described as there's kind of a black hole to the left end of that spectrum, and it's constantly pulling you in that direction. So if you're not intentional about planning, if you're not intentional about having this type of a steering committee that gets together and not only talks about performance, but where the business is headed, what the capabilities of the service provider look like, and how you can join together to innovate, those things aren't going to happen. And the last thing you want to do is have an expectation that you're going to innovate, but the client is treating you like you have a transactional relationship, and they're not sharing that kind of information. That creates a lot of frustration for both parties. All right, good. So let's go ahead and shift on to the next slide. And this is really just to emphasize the point that relationship management in the context of having long-term successful relationships and outsourcing deals, there is a significant economic impact. This isn't just about feeling good about the relationship or liking the people that you work with. The types of things that you would expect to see if you have a good governance and sound relationship would be better customer satisfaction, better response time, much better communication between the two parties. You're going to get innovation and the value-added type benefits associated with those. You're not going to have to duplicate the effort of the service provider, so you'd be able to free up some internal resources to do some other work. And then on the downside, you're going to avoid some of these other things if you don't have a good relationship. You're going to see some of these things exhibited on the bottom side of this. You're going to have to monitor more. You're going to have to waste a lot of time because you can't delegate. Trust goes down. You're not going to communicate. Conflict escalation. You're getting surprised. And so the point here in that box to the right is, and Vantage Partners did this survey a couple of years ago, but it's still very true, is that the majority of the folks in public and private sector on the buy side felt that it was a significant economic impact on having and investing in a good relationship and a good governance structure. So we just want to kind of put that in place because these higher order relationships cost you a little bit more and they cost the service provider a little bit more because you have to have different types of capabilities and resources that are brought to bear. So let's start to wrap things up here. Let's go on to the next slide around some of the key takeaways that we've mentioned here, and I'm going to start going down, and Matt, please jump in here. But it's just very critical that organizations make sure that they understand the reasons to outsource. Why are we doing it today? Since this is a multi-year deal, what are we looking to do potentially in the next few years? Let's make sure that we select the right kind of provider that can meet not only our needs today, but also in the future. Align those expectations as Matt went through that process that West uses. Get alignment between the two organizations and also internally. It's another big piece. And then establish the right kind of governance on your side and make sure that you align with your service provider's account management capabilities. Other comments or key points of emphasis there, Matt?
No, I just it goes back to, again, if you haven't clearly defined it up front and you don't have a good governance process to manage it going forward, it appears that we're always adjusting turning the nozzle or adjusting the throttle to apply resources, pull resources away, and whatever the case may be. If there's a clear path and a clear charter out there as it relates to the term of the contract and the expectations, I think it's so much easier for both parties to move forward and manage consistently as opposed to some of the ups and downs that relationships might bring.
Right. Well, let's go ahead and put up this last slide, and this is your opportunity to ask questions, so you can either submit those online or Arlene, help me out. I think we can just have the folks unmute their phone and ask those whichever way you prefer. And while you guys are submitting those questions or thinking about those questions, let me turn it back over to Matt just to give an overview of what West Corporation does as we're fielding those questions. So Matt, go ahead and talk us through this slide and what you guys
Yeah, sure. So West Corporation, as it states, we're a leading provider of technology-driven communication services. We service Fortune 1000 companies in a variety of industries, specifically telecommunications, retail, financial services, public safety, technology, and healthcare. And really what that says is from a technology and communication standpoint, we do provide a comprehensive solution. We have a wide array of technology as well as agent solutions, and very focused on how we support multi-channel solutions going forward, not just voice, but how do you support things such as automation, social media, texting, things of that nature. We've been around since 1986. We're the largest provider of conferencing. We're a leading provider of emergency communications in the country. And then we provide, again, customer contact solutions. Our agent group covers the full spectrum of a customer life cycle from acquisition through sales, through care, into retention and receivables management. And then we do a lot with alerts and notifications. We have a great automated voice platform, and then, again, leading provider of account receivables management as well.
All right, thanks for that quick overview, Arlene. If we could just go back up a slide to that question so our contact info is there for Matt. So we've got a couple of questions that have come in. I've tried to respond to a couple of them as we've gone through. First one is, will the slides be available for download? And the answer is yes. All of this will be available on outsourcing.com. As Arlene mentioned at the beginning, this session is recorded, and you will be able to access a recording of this. You'll also be able to download a PDF version of the slides for your use. Another question that we had was, what is an example of a unique relationship? And as I mentioned, a unique relationship is it can be a joint venture or a partnership in a legal sense. The example I use a lot is a couple of years old, but it's a good one, that Canon really understood about laser technology. HP really understood printers, and together they formed a joint venture that developed the laser printer and took that to market. So without Canon, HP couldn't have done it, and vice versa. But that's really what a unique relationship is. So what we're saying in this context is it may have some characteristics of that, doesn't necessarily have to be a JV. Matt, any other comments around that? What kind of characteristics or some of those unique relationship aspect or characteristics you've seen?
Now, again, if you look at kind of your relationship spectrum and some of those definitions around that. In addition to a joint venture, I think unique really gets into contractual relationships where there's a lot of vested joint, if you will, both companies are really vested in driving gain sharing type models. They're mutually dependent upon each other, maybe potentially for a homegrown technology solution that they continue to evolve over time. So those are examples from my perspective.
Okay, great. Another question is, and this was a couple of minutes ago when we were going through the selection process, and it says, I get the process of vendor selection, but wonder why so many that offshore work are often so unhappy with the results that we see in many studies, especially one done about a year ago with Phil First's organization. So any thoughts from your perspective, Matt, on why offshore relationships seem to be a bit more problematic?
I think one, you indicated there's always there's a certain brand awareness and affinity that you have to develop, which can be difficult when given the geographic distance. I think the other challenge is when you look at offshore locations, really it comes down to a cost containment or labor arbitrage type solution or relationship. Yet, while that is one outcome, the expectation may be different, saying I want to have a more, my outcome may be more geared toward, or an expectation towards higher customer satisfaction scores. They're kind of not aligned, if you will.
Right, right. I threw out a couple of ideas online from my experiences. Offshore is prevalent in all kinds of outsourcing, but a lot of people associate offshore with application development and potentially maintenance work, which is more project oriented, especially the application development. And we kind of all know the statistics on IT projects in general, maybe 70% success rates on those types of things. So that may be one aspect. The other one is just a proximity issue in many cases, is when you have your workforce or your delivery group that geographically dispersed, it just creates a lot of communication issues and challenges. It's very difficult to innovate if the offshore service provider doesn't have the right mix of onshore versus offshore. Then clients can end up feeling frustrated at the timing, whether what they tried to communicate was actually executed. So you've got those types of issues. And as we've talked about in this webinar, they're skill set issues that may or may not be addressed in the past. So those are a couple of other ones. If you have any other questions, feel free to chime in. There's some nice words coming in from Crow Mead saying thought this was one of the best webinars he's attended, so we appreciate that. Any other comments before we close out here? Any additional questions? Go ahead and put those in. All right, if not, I guess parting comment from me is that if you have not signed up for the roadshow next week in New York and have an opportunity to attend, we'd love to see you there. As Arlene mentioned, I'll be there and we'll be one of the co-chairs there. But we've got an exciting program that delves into a lot of this relationship management in a lot of detail. The other piece is that, as we mentioned, having the right kind of capability, understanding what you're trying to accomplish, developing the right kind of relationship management or relationship with your service provider, these are some of the real keys in selecting the right sourcing provider for long-term success. And that's what I'd leave with you. Matt, just turn it over to you for any parting comments.
No, I think You nailed it, Mike. Really, it's making sure that there's alignment both between the partners and then the expectations and outcomes. That's really critical to driving that. And I think if you do that, the communication and workflow takes care of itself. But thank you, Mike, and thank you, Arlene.
Thank you, and I'd like to thank West Corporation on behalf of the Outsourcing Institute for sponsoring today's webinar, Selecting the Right Sourcing Provider for Long-Term Success. Thank you, everyone, for joining, and have a great day.